In a world of misinformation and fake news, get your news straight from the source with ChessDiagnostic. Hello everybody, we are not talking about news, I am joking. We are going to study an amazing game today, and I just want to address a problem that all chess players have. You're playing a great game, you're playing a winning attack, you get a huge advantage, and then it just all crumbles and you lose anyway. Very frustrating, but it happens to players of all levels. And in this game, it happens to Nakamura against Magnus Carlsen. Now, Carlsen has a huge plus score against Nakamura, but this is a game that Nakamura really should have won. And we're going to start from the white side, even though white loses Nakamura. And it really, let's just see what happens. All right, so d4, knight to f6, c4. After e6, knight to c3, and bishop to b4. We're in the Nimzo-Indian. Similar to the Alexander Kostenowic and John Watson game, but as I said at the top level, a lot of times they sidestep classical variations, and this game's no different. After f3, which Nakamura is planning to play e4 and establish a huge pawn center, we see d5, Carlsen staking a claim in the center for himself, and then a3, just forcing that dark square bishop to decide if it wants to double white c-pawns, but again, unorthodox moves, bishop back. So Carlsen keeps his bishop pair, but he's going to be a little cramped and behind in development. After e4, we see pawn takes, and then e5. So Carlsen's plan is to allow white to establish a strong pawn center, but poke holes with these dark squares. Now, of course, white's not going to take, weakening his own pawns and basically encouraging a queen trade. So he plays d5. And Carlsen immediately exploits it with bishop to c5, planning bishop to d4 and something like c5, or bringing his knight out and attacking the e4 pawn. Now, we don't see that variation, although we do see bishop to d4. And actually at this point, Nakamura has a slight edge because of his stronger pawn center and quicker development. So after bishop to g5, pinning that knight, we see castles, and then knight to f3, just simply developing. And now, after bishop to g4, pinning that knight, Nakamura forces a trade of a knight for a bishop with h3. Now, if the bishop moves back, he'll win the e5 pawn. So the bishop has to take, and now after queen takes, he's putting pressure automatically on f6 and ready to castle queenside. Now, that's a slight unorthodox position for the Nimzo-Indian. Normally, white's not castling queenside, but again, here we are. So knight to d7, bolstering that knight. And now actually after castles queenside and bishop to d4, black's okay, even though white has a slight edge, but there's a latent threat of attacking this e5 pawn if he breaks the pin, something like knight to c5, attacking the queenside as well as e4, and this bishop's actually pretty strong. After the knight moves back though, attacking it, he can't really play knight to c5, he has to play c5 with a pawn. White doesn't want to take en passant because that would just open the queen side and give away his strong protected passed pawn. And the knight doesn't really want to take that bishop because he'd rather use it for his kingside attack. So we immediately see g4. And Carlsen even stated in the post-game interview that he underestimated Nakamura's kingside attack because it looks like he could play g6 and there's really no way to break through. But actually Nakamura finds a way to break through. So let's see what happens. We see a5, preparing to bring this rook into the queenside attack, but it's a little slow, and actually white is starting to develop an advantage at this point, a winning advantage. So the king moves over, and then we see the rook becoming active. Knight to g3, threatening something like knight to f5 or knight to h5. So Carlsen plays g6, protecting these light squares, but creating other holes, such as this hole here, and Nakamura can actually just start rolling his pawns, which he does with h4. And then we see a4, Carlsen simply ignoring the threat of an attack and again underestimating the possibility of white's breakthrough. So we see the rook up, protecting that b2 pawn on the queen side, as well as preparing a rook doubling on the h-file. After the queen comes up, again, removing the queen from the center and possibly quick defense of the king side and starting his own queenside attack, we see the bishop come back with a tempo. The queen goes back to c7, and then after g5, things start getting very dangerous for black. The knight moves back, and then we see h5. So Carlsen stated he started worrying around this time, but he just resumed his queenside attack and basically tried to hang on for one move at a time. So with rook to b6 threatening that pawn, the bishop has to go back to defend it, and the rook's defending as well. After the rook comes up, threatens the queen, we see queen to g4. Further activating this queen, and also preparing something like queen to h4 to attack on this h-file. So white is basically winning at this point because of black's inactivity and discoordination. These knights, Carlsen tries to get them as active as possible, but it's quite difficult, and according to the analysis, he's behind by one tempo, but it's still a very difficult position because the knights can come in and he has his queenside attack, but even though his pieces are all on the queen side, white's attack is quicker. So the knight comes to b6, preparing a threat of knight to d6, and then the c4 pawn, bishop to e2, opening up this rook and preparing again an attack on the h-file, and then we see knight to d6. So after the rooks double on the h-file, we see Carlsen just try to strike back even though he's losing at this point with bishop takes, and then knight takes c4, bishop trade, and then knight takes c4. So he basically gave away a piece for a couple pawns for a non-winning attack, and actually white is going to open the position with pawn takes. So after queen to b6, of course white doesn't want to take with this pawn check, because actually that would be losing for black. You always got to be careful with that when you're trying to open up with pawns, just throwing everything at the king side. You don't want to blockade or allow black to blockade those pawns, because then they'll actually just reduce your piece's activity. So he makes the correct move, actually, of g7, and then after the rook takes, well, the rook moves first, but after queen to h4 and rook takes check, of course he's not going to take here because we'd get queen takes b2 checkmate, a rather sudden end. After king to a1, sidestepping that check, there's really no other checks. Rook check doesn't accomplish anything, but rook takes rook, and then Carlsen is forced to accept that he's losing and play queen to g6, protecting the h7 pawn because he was threatening a mate in one. So Nakamura has a lot of ways to win at this point. He first plays knight to f5, protecting that g2 pawn or g7 pawn, and then also threatening knight to e7 check, forking the king and the queen. The rook plays to e8 just to defend against that threat, and now again there's a lot of ways. He could even just simply play queen to h6. He plays queen to g4, threatening something like rook to win the queen. The queen moves over, and then we see queen to h3. The queen has to move back. There's really no good options for black. And again, there's a lot of ways to win. One method is queen back here, and then after something like b5, there's actually a brilliant sacrifice with rook takes. And basically the queen's forced to give itself up after takes and then check, and the queen has to take. And these passed pawns will decide the queen will definitely be strong enough. So that was a quite simple way to win, but hard to find. Apparently this was around the time control, so Nakamura started having trouble. Let's see what happens. So after the queen moves back to g6, we see actually a sudden blunder with d6, making things almost equal, giving white a slight edge, actually. So white will win a piece. Carlsen comes up with a sacrifice, and the reason d6 is weak is because it opens the lines for the queen to get an escape, as well as weakens this e4 pawn. So he could have just basically stacked on the pressure as white, because black is almost in a zugzwang position here, with no squares to move. The rook's stuck here, the king can't move, these pawns can't move, and the knight is just basically doing nothing. So there's a lot of ways to win, and now we're going to flip over to the other side. So Carlsen was, just as he said, trying to hang on one move at a time, and after d6, he actually sacked a knight. Now he can't really take here. Obviously, he'd get checkmated, so we don't see that. and after the rook comes over, black is suddenly becoming active. Now the knight can't really move back because we'll get something like rook check, and actually there's a mate in 5, it's saying here, after king to a2 and queen to e6 check. So he would actually lose after that variation. So the knight moves back, and then we see queen takes e4, still covering the h7 pawn. And unfortunately, black has all these pawns that he starts to exploit rather suddenly. Nakamura was probably just very frustrated at this point, so he makes another mistake with queen to h5, further reducing his queen's activity and coverage. It's saying that white could actually just try to draw with knight to e3, but again, when you go from a sudden win to a sudden loss, or a suddenly equal position, it can be very hard as the player to adjust and go for a draw. So we see queen to h5, and then black is suddenly very active. Again, I'm always talking about activity. This is the reason he loses, because he allowed Carlsen to get a modicum of activity, and Carlsen is probably the greatest player of activity ever. He knows how to use any activity to gain a huge advantage and win. So let's see what happens in the end. Rook attacks the queen. Queen moves back. It has to maintain that h7 protection. The queen comes back, trying to defend now. And then we see b5, just starting to advance his pawns and win some pawns. And now after the knight moves up, it's pretty much all over, because the queen and knight and pawn against the queen and all this huge mass of pawns is just no way to play. So Carlsen's just trying to go for a queen trade, and then he starts advancing his pawns, and it's actually quite easy to play at this point. Simply pushing his passed pawns. Of course, knight doesn't want to take, because there would be either a trade of the queens, or he would just check, promote. Very simply, just advancing his pawns. And after a couple more moves, check, queen forward, and then after queen check, Nakamura resigned, because this pawn's promoting, getting another queen, and an unfortunate Nakamura nightmare. I'm sure I think he said in an interview somewhere that this game gives him nightmares, or he had nightmares after the game. Chess players always get these kinds of experiences when you're playing at any level, and I just wanted to cover this game because it was a very interesting game where Nakamura developed a huge advantage against the world champion, and he still managed to lose. So I hope you enjoyed this analysis. I tried to keep it even and going along. I didn't show as many variations as I'd like, but I didn't want it to get too confusing. It's a very confusing game in the end, and it's just full of a lot of blunders, but a lot of very tactical play. So I hope you enjoyed this, and stick around for future videos. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future videos. See you in the future.